Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're taking a look at classical Indian philosophy.
Right.
And specifically, the philosophy of perception and concepts. As a philosopher, I think you'll find this one quite interesting.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating area, and we've got a great resource to dive into. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on perceptual experience and concepts in classical Indian philosophy.
Oh, yeah. It's a really dense entry, though.
Yeah.
Like a lot packed in there. So, where should we even begin with all this? I mean, we're talking about how do we know what we know? How do our senses connect with our minds? That kind of...
Absolutely, yeah. Big questions right at the heart of epistemology. And the different schools of classical Indian philosophy had some really fascinating and sometimes very different answers.
Yeah. So, are we just passively receiving information about the world through our senses? Or is our mind actively shaping what we perceive?
That's a core debate we're going to explore. And it gets even more complex when we bring in the question of concepts. Those general categories and meanings we use to understand the world.
Right. Because, we don't just see a jumble of colors and shapes. We see a tree, a table, a person, and so on. But how do those concepts come into play? Are they just mental constructs we impose on reality? Or are they reflecting something real in the world itself?
Exactly. And you'll see a real spectrum of views on this. Some schools, like Nyaya and Mimamsa, were realists. They argued that concepts, those general categories, correspond to real properties, often called universals, that exist in the world.
So for them, there's something out there that makes all cows cow, all trees tree, and so on.
Right. But then you have the Buddhists who took a very different stance, more of a nominalist view. They said, nope, only particulars are real, those unique individual things. Concepts are more like mental tools we use. Convenient, but not ultimately reflecting some deep reality.
Okay, so big disagreement there. And then you mentioned there were some other schools, like the Vedantins and Jainas, kind of somewhere in between.
Yeah. They had versions of what we might call conceptualism, but the entry points out that ultimately they tend to lean towards either realism or nominalism in their implications. It's a complex landscape.
It really is. So to clarify for our listener, we have this fundamental question. Is what we perceive, that raw experience, just pure sensory data? Or is it already shaped by concepts? Are those two separate stages or all mixed up together?
That's a really good way to put it. And the different schools had some pretty strong opinions on this. The Nyaya, Sakya, and Mimamsa schools, those realists we talked about, generally went for a T-stage process.
Okay, so walk me through that.
They said there's this initial non-conceptual perception, a kind of pure sensory encounter, like just raw data hitting your senses. Then your mind kicks in and does its thing, applies concepts, identifies what you're sensing, and you get conceptual perception. And they saw both as valid ways of knowing.
Gotcha. But I bet not everyone was on board with that.
You bet. The Buddhists, they were all about that pure, non-conceptual perception as the real deal. They thought bringing in concepts just muddies the waters, adds interpretation that might not be accurate.
Makes sense. Concepts can be fuzzy, right? When exactly does a pile of sand become a beach? Where's the line?
Exactly. And then you have the grammarians, or Shabdikas. They went hardcore in the opposite direction. Denied the whole idea of non-conceptual perception, said everything we're aware of is already tied up with language.
Wow. No pure experience at all for them, huh? And then you mentioned Advaita Vedanta agreeing with the Buddhists, but for totally different reasons.
Right. They kind of see non-conceptual perception as ultimately more valid, but it's tied up with their whole metaphysics of consciousness, which we'll get into later. It's a different path to a similar idea.
Okay, so we've laid out the battlefield. Now let's zoom in on some of these key players. Where do you want to start?
Let's dive into the Buddhist perspective first. Specifically, what's often called Buddhist nominalism. They had some really interesting ideas about how we form concepts without positing real universals.
Yeah, because if everything is just constantly changing particulars, how do we even get those general categories?
Right. So a key figure here is Dinaga. He was a Buddhist Yogacara philosopher, and his definition of perception is super important. He said perception is devoid of conceptual construction. In Sanskrit, that's kalpanapatar.
So before our mind starts slapping labels on everything.
Exactly. It's that raw experience before you categorize, identify, or name it. And this definition has a couple of huge implications. First, it means perception is fundamentally non-conceptual.
Right, which is what they were all about, seeing things as they are, not as we think they are.
Exactly. For Dyaga, it was often summed up as no seeing is seeing as. Anytime you start saying, oh, that's a tree, you've moved away from that initial pure perception. You're adding your interpretation.
Interesting. And what's the second big implication of this definition?
Well, it ties into the idea of Yogacara as a form of idealism. Since Dhyanaga's definition focuses on the experience of perception, what it's like to perceive, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a physical object out there causing that perception. For a Buddhist idealist, the object might actually be arising within consciousness itself.
Whoa, that's getting into some mind-bending territory.
Yeah.
So, like, the tree I see isn't actually out there, but in my mind.
That's a simplified way to put it, but yeah, that's the general idea. And this caused a lot of debate, especially with the realist Hindu schools who were very much about a mind-independent external world. Even within Buddhist philosophy, there were different interpretations of this idealism. Some saw it as denying external objects altogether, others as saying reality itself is fundamentally mental, and still others focused on the idea that what we're directly aware of is always part of our own cognition. It's a nuanced issue.
It sounds like it. And then we have this interesting exchange between Vasubandhu and Dharmakirti, both Yogacara philosophers. What was that all about?
Right. So Vasubandhu, an earlier Yogacara thinker, used this idea of ignorance to argue for metaphysical idealism. He basically said if we can't definitively prove something exists outside of our minds, we have no good reason to believe it does. But Dharmakirti, who came later, wasn't entirely convinced. He was really into Buddhist logic and epistemology, and he thought simply saying we can't prove it so it doesn't exist was a bit too hasty.
So Dharmakirti was more careful about what we can actually claim to know.
Exactly. He developed this concept of anupalabdhi, which means non-apprehension. He said we can use this to demonstrate that specific things don't exist in specific contexts, but we can't use it to just blanketly deny the existence of a whole category of things, like the entire external world.
Makes sense. You can't just say, I don't see a unicorn, therefore unicorns don't exist.
Right. Dharmakirti shifted the focus to the inherent problems with using perception to prove there's an external world. He said, look, we only perceive fragments of things from our own limited perspective. And our perceptions can be caused by internal mental stuff too, not just external objects. Plus, he was really big on this idea that awareness is always self-aware, and we never have awareness without some object appearing. So that makes you wonder if they're really distinct things in the first place.
That's deep. It almost sounds like he's saying the very way we perceive makes it tricky to say for sure what's out there versus in here.
That's a good way to put it. Now let's shift gears to the Nyaya school. They were, like we said, all about realism, a mind-independent world.
Yeah.
How did they go about defining perception to counter these Buddhist arguments?
Okay, bring on the realists.
So the Nyaya school had this very specific and influential definition of perception laid out in the Nyaya Sutra. It says, perception is a cognition that arises from the contact of a sense organ and an object, and it's nonverbal, non-erroneous, and well ascertained.
Whoa, that's a mouthful. And I bet each part of that definition sparked a ton of debate.
You're absolutely right. For example, they argued a lot about whether perception is itself knowledge or just a way of getting knowledge.
Right, because they're saying perception is always accurate. How do you account for mistakes?
Exactly. And then there's that word contact. Seems simple, but it wasn't. The original Sanskrit is sanikarsa, which actually means more like drawing near or close connection.
So they had to be flexible to cover things like sight and hearing, where you're not literally touching the object.
Right. Light has to hit your eye. Sound waves have to reach your ear. It's about that connection, even if it's not direct physical touch.
Okay, I'm following. Now, what about those three adjectives they used? Nonverbal, non-erroneous, and well ascertained. Those seem pretty key, especially compared to the Buddhist view.
You're spot on. Vatsyana, an early commentator, said nonverbal means perception doesn't rely on language, which went against the grammarians who said all awareness is linguistic, and well ascertained meant perception gives you a clear, definite grasp of the object, no wavering or doubt.
So for them, you don't just kind of sense something, you actually know what it is.
Exactly. But then a later commentator, Vakaspati Mishra, suggested those two adjectives might actually describe two different types of perception. A non-conceptual stage, pure sensory, and then a conceptual stage where you identify and categorize.
Interesting. So he's kind of bridging the gap, acknowledging that pure sensory input, but also saying we do go on to form conceptual understanding. What did other Nayikas think of that?
Most of them didn't fully agree with that two-stage interpretation.
Really? Why not?
Well, they tended to see those adjectives as all part of one definition. They said, sure, all perception starts non-verbally, but the non-verbal part is just saying words don't cause perception. It doesn't mean there isn't a conceptual stage where we apply concepts.
So it's not about two separate types of perception, but about how words fit into the process, or don't fit in, really.
Right. And they were very insistent that these concepts we use, they're not just random mental things. They reflect real properties in the world. So that's a big difference from the Buddhists who saw concepts as more like our own projections.
So for Naya, the concept cow is grounded in some real cowness out there in the world.
Exactly. They called these real properties vikalpa, which are basically universals, and they saw conceptualization as recognizing and combining these vikalpa, not just slapping labels on things.
Okay, that's a pretty clear distinction between them and the Buddhists. But you mentioned earlier that even the Nayikas, those hardcore realists, eventually came around to the idea of non-conceptual perception. What happened there?
Well, those Buddhist arguments were pretty persuasive, and in the 10th century, Vakispati Mishra, in his commentary, said, okay, fine, there's this initial non-conceptual stage. He called it indeterminate perception, or nivikalpaka. It happens before the mind jumps in with all the categories and labels.
So he's kind of conceding a point to the Buddhists, but still maintaining the Nyaya framework.
Right. And then along comes Ganesha, a major figure in Navya. He really cemented this idea of indeterminate perception. He said it's crucial to explain how we even get concepts in the first place.
I can see that. You have to have some basic sensory awareness before you can say, oh, that's a thing called a cow.
Exactly. He used the example of a child seeing a cow for the first time. The child initially just has this vague awareness of cowness as a property. Then later they connect it to the concept cow and the word cow.
Makes sense. And didn't Ganesha also offer a new definition of perception? One that wasn't so focused on sensory contact?
Yep. He thought that focusing on the senses was too limited, and he proposed a more streamlined definition. Perception is simply any awareness that doesn't have another awareness as its main cause. So it's all about the directness of the experience.
Interesting. So shifting the focus more to the knowing subject and the nature of that awareness itself.
Right. And he spent a lot of time explaining how his definition could account for both accurate perception and illusions, which was a big challenge for them.
Okay, so Nyaya, starting as hardcore realists, eventually integrated the idea of non-conceptual perception to strengthen their position. Now, what about the Mimamsa school? Where did they stand on all this?
Well, the Purva Mimamsa Sutra has this line about perception arising from a connection between our senses and an existing object. But there's been debate about whether that was even meant as a real definition of perception.
Oh, why not?
Kumarila Bhatia, a very influential Mimamsa thinker, argued that the context of that sutra was specifically about Dharma, not about perception in general. And he also thought it was too broad, potentially including mistakes and even inferences, which they wanted to keep separate from direct perception.
So not a super clear-cut definition from the get-go.
Right. But an earlier commentator actually suggested a little tweak to the wording to make it a better definition. He said, basically, switch the order of a couple words, and you get something like, a cognition resulting from our senses connecting with an object is true perception if that object is the same one that appears in the cognition.
Okay, so that little switch is trying to weed out errors and inferences where what we think we perceive isn't actually what caused the perception.
Exactly. Now, Kumarila, much like the Nayikas, was really against the Buddhist idea that perception is always non-conceptual. He said we need both stages, pre-conceptual and conceptual. He described that initial non-conceptual perception as what happens when you encounter something totally new, like a baby seeing something for the first time. They just have this basic grasp of something's there, but no real details yet.
That makes sense. It's like before you can even categorize it, you just have that raw awareness.
Yeah.
Did he agree with the Buddhists that this initial awareness is impossible to put into words?
He did agree on that, but he differed in a big way. He argued that even though you can't describe it, this initial awareness actually grasps both the particular thing and the universal. And that's essential for conceptual awareness to develop later. So for him, universals are just as real and directly perceived as particulars.
Okay, so for Kumarila, we're not just seeing a bunch of unique things.
Right.
We're also seeing the cowness in the cow,
Yeah.
the treeness in the tree right from the start.
Right, and this really highlights the difference between the realist Hindu schools and the Buddhists. Both acknowledge a kind of pure sensory experience, but they disagree about what's being grasped in that experience.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've covered Nyaya and Mimamsa, both realist schools with two-stage models of perception. What about the Sakya school? How did they approach this?
Sakya also went for a two-stage model, which, as you'll notice, was a pretty common theme among the realists. Early on, they defined perception really simply just as the sense organs doing their thing, interacting with their specific objects.
Sounds straightforward enough. What was the problem with that?
Well, this skeptic named Jayashripathy pointed out that this definition doesn't tell us how to tell a correct perception from a mistake. It was too vague.
Oh, yeah, that's a big problem if you're trying to build a theory of knowledge. How do you know when your senses are giving you accurate information?
Exactly. So later, Sakya philosophers came up with a more sophisticated definition. They said perception is an ascertainment of the intellect, or buddhi, in relation to a sense faculty. So it's not just the senses doing their thing, the intellect has to get involved.
So the intellect is making sense of the data the senses provide, kind of like filtering and interpreting it.
Right. They said the first stage is just this mere seeing or mere contact, where the sense organ registers the presence of something, but there's no categorization yet. Then the intellect steps in and does the identifying, like it determines this is a cow, not just something is there.
Okay, so similar to Nyaya and Mimamsa, we have this two-step process. Sensory data, then intellectual processing.
Exactly. A pretty consistent pattern among those realist schools. Now, finally, we get to Advaita Vedanta. As we mentioned before, their big thing is the directness of knowledge. How does that play into their understanding of perception?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear how that works.
So for them, the most important thing about perception is that it gives us immediate knowledge. The actual mechanics of how our senses connect with objects, which Nia and Mimamsa focused on, were less central for them.
Interesting. So it's more about the nature of the knowing experience itself.
Right. And they even used examples like feeling pleasure or pain as types of perception because those are directly felt, no external sense object needed. They argued that perception at its core is just consciousness manifesting itself in relation to an object, a direct knowing without any intermediary. And it's interesting that the entry points out a similarity here to the later Navyanayikas, who also moved away from that strict sense contact definition.
Okay, so both Advaita Vedanta and Navyunaya, despite their differences, seem to be emphasizing the immediacy of the knowing experience. But I thought Advaita Vedanta was all about non-dualism. Doesn't that kind of contradict the idea of separate objects of perception?
That's a great question. The Neo-Advaitins do acknowledge the difference between conceptual and non-conceptual perception as it appears in our everyday experience, but from the ultimate metaphysical perspective of Brahman, that distinction is considered to be unreal.
So, like, for practical purposes, sure, we can talk about concepts and categories, but ultimately, it's all just Brahman.
Exactly. Now, how do they explain the process of conceptual perception within this framework? Well, they say it involves the mind, or antakarana, extending out through a sense organ and kind of pervading the object. This causes the object to appear to the mind as data, which then creates a mental state or mode of viti that corresponds to the object. And the consciousness, Caitanya, associated with that mental state gets identified with the consciousness that's also the ultimate reality of the object, and boom, you have a determinate perception like, this is a jar.
Okay, so a lot of steps there, but it still leads to that direct knowing of the object, not just a mental representation.
Right. They maintain that in veridical perception, you're actually aware of the object itself, not just your idea of it.
Got it. And what about non-conceptual perception? Where does that fit in for Advaita Vedanta, given their focus on non-dual consciousness?
David Applebaum offers an interesting interpretation here. He says, for Advaitins, non-conceptual perception isn't just a stepping stone to conceptual perception. It's actually a more fundamental kind of knowing. It gives us a direct awareness of pure existence, Sanmatra, which is that underlying being that makes up reality. And he argues that this kind of perception can even lead to an intuitive awareness of Atman, the individual self, and its identity with Brahman.
Whoa, so non-conceptual perception has some serious spiritual weight in this view. It's not just about gathering basic sensory information. It's a path to realizing ultimate reality.
Exactly. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time digging into how these different schools thought about perception itself, but the other big piece of the puzzle is concepts. And this seems to be where the Hindu realists and the Buddhist nominalists really went head-to-head.
Yeah, because the realists are saying concepts reflect real universal properties out there in the world, but the Buddhists are saying, no, those universals are just mental constructs. It's a pretty fundamental disagreement.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the classic philosophical problem of universals. Do they exist independently, or are they just in our heads? The Buddhists came up with this really ingenious idea called the doctrine of exclusion, or appa. It was their way of explaining concepts in language without relying on real universals.
Okay, so how did apuha work?
Dianaga, who we talked about earlier, said a word like cow doesn't refer to some real universal cowness. Instead, it refers to everything that's not a non-cow. So it's all about negation and exclusion.
Wait, so the meaning of a word is defined by what it's not rather than what it is. That's kind of mind-bending.
It is, and they took this seriously. They said universals are basically imaginary, just mental tools. Only the individual, momentary particulars are really real. And they argued that words can't actually express those particulars directly. Language works by ruling things out, not by pointing to some shared essence.
I can see how that would fit with their whole emphasis on the constantly changing nature of reality. If everything is just a flow of unique moments, maybe there aren't any fixed categories to point to.
Right. But those realist Hindu schools were not buying it. They had some pretty strong objections to the whole apaha theory.
I bet they did. So what were their main criticisms?
Well, they questioned the whole metaphysics of apaha. They said, if a word's meaning is just not this, not that, how do you even understand that not this without implicitly referring back to the thing you're negating? It seemed like they were sneaking universals back in through the back door.
So like to understand non-cow,
Yeah.
you still need some idea of what a cow is. It's a tricky concept.
Exactly. And then they had epistemological problems with it. How do you come to know these apahas if they're not real things you can perceive or infer? Any attempt to infer them seemed circular.
Yeah, if you need to know cow to understand non-cow and non-cow to understand cow, where do you even start?
Right. And they also brought up linguistic issues, like how does apaha explain synonyms, words with the same meaning? Or how do we learn words in the first place if their meanings are based on these complex exclusions? Kumarila Baita had this really influential argument called the mutual presupposition objection. He said, to know that cow means not non-cow, you already have to know what non-cow means, which implies you already know what cow means. It's a vicious circle.
That's a clever critique.
Yeah.
It does seem like they're defining things in terms of each other, which gets you nowhere.
Right. So the apaha theory was facing some serious challenges from the realists. Did later Buddhist philosophers try to defend it or refine it at all?
Yeah, did they have any good counter-arguments?
Dharmakirti, who we mentioned before, a very influential Buddhist logician, did try to address some of these concerns. He argued that all meaningful language inherently involves exclusion. Like, if you tell someone to do something, you're implicitly excluding other actions. He also pointed out that words are often used in situations of doubt or confusion, and the context helps to make their meaning and their exclusions more clear.
So he's saying it's not just about abstract definitions, it's about how words function in real situations.
Exactly. And to address the synonymy problem, he said, sure, different words might refer to the same object, but their meanings as apohas are different because they exclude different things. So one word for cow might exclude certain animals, while another word for cow excludes a different set, even though they both ultimately refer to the same type of creature. He was pretty clever in how he tried to work around those realist objections.
Yeah, I can see how they would make the meanings more specific and avoid the simple circularity problem. But was he still basically committed to that idea that only particulars are ultimately real?
Oh, absolutely. He held on to that. He saw the world as made up of these unique, unified particulars, and he believed that direct perception is always accurate. It's when we start conceptualizing that we introduce error by imposing general categories onto these particulars.
Okay, so he's still a nominalist at heart, but he's trying to give a more sophisticated account of how a poet can actually work in language and thought.
Exactly. Now, later scholars have also pointed out different approaches within a poher. Dunaga's original approach was kind of top-down, starting with the idea of negating universals and then trying to explain how words pick out real particulars. Dharmakirti was more bottom-up, trying to connect the dots between sensory particulars and the formation of concepts in a more cause-and-effect way.
Interesting. So two different strategies for tackling the same problem. But in the end, the Hindu realists weren't really convinced by any of this, were they?
Not really. The Nayavaishinka school stuck to their guns, saying universals are real, they exist in the world, and we perceive them directly when we perceive particular things. Their motto was basically, if it exists, it has instances. They just didn't see the need for all the mental gymnastics of apoha.
Seems straightforward enough. What about Mimasa? Did they have a different take?
Well, remember their commitment to the eternality of the Vedas? They thought that required eternal word meanings, which for them meant universals had to be real. So they also argued for the direct perception of universals. They used examples like recognizing someone as a Brahmin from a distance. They said you're not just seeing a particular person, you're also seeing the universal Brahminhood instantiated in them.
Okay, so for both Nyaya and Mimamsa, universals are out there in the world, and we're directly aware of them in our experience, not just creating them in our minds.
Right. And this idea of a non-particular individual might be helpful here. A universal is something that can be present in many different individuals without being identical to any one of them.
I like that analogy. It helps to visualize what they're getting at. So how did the Nyaya school in particular explain how we actually come to know these universals?
An early thinker, Prashastapada, said we get them through the senses when they're present in the objects we perceive. Later, Jayantapata suggested we grasp them even in that initial indeterminate perception. And then Gogesha, in the Navyanaya school, really fleshed this out.
Okay, so Gagesha, our friend from before, back at it again. What did he say about knowing universals?
He argued that when you see something and you're like, that's a cow, that judgment actually depends on a prior non-relational awareness of the universal cowness. He even laid out a whole 5-step argument to support this. Basically, he's saying you need to have some grasp of the universal before you can recognize a particular thing as belonging to that category.
So we can't just jump from seeing a particular cow to knowing the concept cow. There has to be some prior awareness of cowness as a property.
Right, and he said this avoids a problem of infinite regress. If you need to know a qualifier, where does it end? But if you have this direct grasp of the universal indeterminate perception, you have that foundation.
Okay, that's a pretty clever solution.
Yeah.
So for Gagesha, those universals, or qualifiers as he called them, are the objects of that initial non-conceptual perception, which then allows us to have determinate conceptual perceptions later on.
Exactly, and this really reinforces their realist position. Concepts are rooted in real features of the world, not just made up in our minds. Now, there's one last big piece we need to address. The issue of perceptual illusion. If perception is supposed to be non-erroneous, how do these different schools explain the fact that we sometimes see things wrong?
Yeah, that's a big one. We all make mistakes, misinterpret things, see things that aren't there. How do you reconcile that with this idea of perception as a reliable source of knowledge?
Right. The skeptics had a field day with this. They pointed to all sorts of examples like mistaking a rope for a snake or seeing a mirage in the desert. And of course, they brought up dreams, those classic examples of the mind creating its own reality. Vasubandhu, that Buddhist skeptic we talked about earlier, even used these illusions to argue for idealism, saying maybe the whole external world is just a projection of consciousness, like a waking dream.
Okay, that's a powerful challenge. If our mind can trick us so easily, how do we know what's real? What did the realists say to that?
Both Nyaya and Advaita Vedanta had responses. They basically said illusions depend on veridical perception for their existence. So Vatsyayana, for instance, said, when you mistake a stump for a man, it's because you already have a concept of what a man looks like. The error is built on a foundation of correct perception. And Shakara pointed out what he saw as a contradiction in the skeptic's argument. He said, when you describe an illusion, you often use terms that imply something external, like it appeared as though there was a snake. So even when you're denying externality, you're still relying on the idea of something external.
Okay, so they're saying you can't have an illusion without some basis in reality, some correct perception to twist or misinterpret.
Exactly. Now, some skeptics, like Feldman, pushed back on this, saying, well, imagine if you only ever experienced dreams, then you wouldn't have that foundation of veridical perception. But the realists countered by saying, look, you can't even imagine something totally unreal. It has to have some basis in your experience.
Like, you can't just make up something out of nothing. It has to have some features, some qualities borrowed from things you've already encountered.
Right. And the Nyaya school had this whole theory of imagination where they said imagination involves taking properties from one thing and superimposing them on another. So an absolutely unreal thing with no properties whatsoever wouldn't even be imaginable. Udayatthikara even turned the whole dream argument on its head. He said, how do you know dream objects are unreal unless you have waking experience to compare them to? So he used that to argue for the existence of at least some real external objects.
Clever move. So it sounds like this debate about illusion and the reliability of perception, it didn't have a clear winner. Both sides had strong points.
That's a good way to sum it up. The realists had some good defenses against the most radical skeptical arguments, but those challenges still raise some important questions about the limits of perception and the criteria for distinguishing between true and false appearances.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this.